Welcome to the last session of our 2022 FoodTreX Research Summit, and I am pleased to introduce you today to Matthew Stone, who will be talking about the overlap between wine tourists and beer tourists. So Matthew, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric, and it's great to be back at the FoodTreX Summit. All right, I'll talk today about the overlap between wine tourists and beer tourists. We can say wine travelers and beer travelers. They're exactly the same thing under this definition. I might use the words interchangeably. The background on wine travelers segmentation, starting with wine travelers, is about 2/3 of the studies of wine travelers have focused on segmenting wine travelers into different segments. So, for example, Charters and Ali Knight in 2002 said there's 4 categories of visitors: wine lovers, wine interested, wine novices, and hangers-on who have no interest in wine. Another researcher, Holland Matsionis, said there's wine lovers, wine interested, and then curious tourists. Tourism New South Wales in 2000 said there's accidental, interested, and dedicated wine tourists. What we know about wine travelers, we can basically put them on a continuum. Those who love wine, those who like wine, and those who are just at a wine experience and really not that interested in wine. But what we found out in wine tourism is it's rarely a discrete activity. When people are traveling for wine, there are some destinations of the world you might go to particularly for wine, such as Napa Valley here in California. But you wouldn't often take only a wine trip, right? During that wine trip, you're going to go to museums, or you're going to go to concerts, or you're going to have gourmet meals, or maybe just some local meals. Maybe you'll go to farmers markets. So very seldom is a wine traveler going to do only one thing while traveling. Beer traveler segmentation is a lot newer. There hasn't been a ton of research on beer travelers yet. And when we're looking at beer travelers, initial researchers, this started about 10, 15 years later than wine tourism research. And they said, you know what, you're not only a beer traveler if your primary motivation for travel is to visit a brewery or a beer trail. But a lot of times, again, I'm not going somewhere solely for beer. I'm going there for many different activities. So later on, they've kind of changed that definition to say, well, a beer traveler, you're purposefully traveling for a beer experience, even if that might not be the only or the main reason you're traveling. Because again, it's unlikely I'm traveling all across the United States just to go to a brewery. I'll include it in other activities while I'm there. And so we can kind of beer traveler segmentations kind of broken into a group where they say, well, those are primarily motivated by beer when they travel, and secondarily, and they'll do beer experiences, but they're only secondarily motivated by the beer. Well, what this really lacks is we're looking at wine travelers as one population of people, right? They love wine, and what are we doing for wine when they travel? And these beer travelers again. But when we're looking at travelers, it's hard to just look at a sports interested traveler or an adventure traveler, because they're doing so much more than that when they're traveling. So the research I've done with the World Food Travel Association, our Food Travel Monitor, said that 50% of the travelers who participated in a beer activity also participated in a wine activity. So we have this huge overlap between these two segments. So it's difficult to look at a wine traveler without looking at them in a broader perspective. Our research showed that wine travelers are more likely to drink local beers while traveling. And it also showed that these beer travelers are more likely to drink local wines while traveling. So from a broad perspective, we can start to say that these beverage travelers are kind of a cultural omnivore. They want many different experiences when they travel. And we're starting to see many destinations take advantage of this overlap between beer and wine travelers. An example is the state of Oregon in the United States. Oregon has the Willamette Valley wine region. They also have a great craft beer culture that dates back a couple decades. We can look at Sonoma in California. So Sonoma is known particularly for its wine in California, but also its breweries, such as Russian River Brewing, famous for its Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger beers. People travel for those beers. So we're starting to see some destinations really capitalize on both beer and wine together. So here's what the study method we did for this one. And we were looking at U.S. travelers, and we had a population of a sample size of almost 1,500 travelers. We balanced this by age and by generation. And I'll give you a couple quick details on who these travelers were. We did limit those to to 21 and up, because the legal drinking age in the United States is 21. So it was a big survey we did, attitudes and behaviors. I'll focus really only on the wine and beer travelers for this one. Give you a little bit of a breakdown. 60%, let's see, a little over 50% were female in this sample. As far as generations, the largest generation in this sample was millennials and Generation X, with almost 700 people. I'm sorry, millennials and Generation Z, almost 700 respondents, Generation X, about 500 respondents, and baby boomers, about 300 respondents. We skewed a little bit young because baby boomers are starting to age out a little bit from some travel activities. Overall, the median annual income was close to 100,000, and it was split between people with children at home. As with most studies on travelers, about over 75% have a college, graduate from college. So here's what we break down, and here's how we defined wine and beer travelers. If you participated in a wine activity while traveling in the past 2 years, you'd be considered a wine traveler. And if you could participate in a beer activity in the past 2 years, you'd be considered a beer traveler. And then we can start to combine that. So overall, again, in this sample, excuse me, a majority did neither beer nor wine activities. And so we can look at that and start to say, well, this is a niche travel activity, beer and wine. But as we know, niche travel activities can be some of the easiest to target and some of the most profitable as far as segmentation goes. And when we start to break down of the about a little over 600 folks who are in the beverage category, it's almost evenly split between folks who do beer only, wine only, or split between beer and wine. So what I wanted to look at on this research is, what are the attributes of each of these market segments? In what ways are they similar? We can group them together, right? We did see that beer travelers and wine travelers overlapped. And in what ways might they be different? And so let's take just a look at some ideas here. So we ask questions about learning. For example, I learn about local food and drink when I visit a destination. I consider myself to be knowledgeable about food and drink in general. And you can kind of see those neither travelers are on the farthest side. They rank the lowest. Those on a 1 to 5 scale, on an agree to disagree, Likert type scale. And so based on what we see here, it looks like, wow, the beer and wine travelers are the most interested in learning. They perceive that they know the most about food and drink. And then wine, beer, and that. But again, in statistics, we need to look at actual statistical differences, and these turned out to be the same. So basically, all beer and wine travelers learn more about food and drink when they visit. So as a destination, you can start to think about these people want to learn. They don't just want to eat and drink. So let's teach them while they go, right? How can we add knowledge on the menu and history and brewing styles and things like that? On this consider itself knowledgeable, there was a little difference here. These groups were the highest. This was kind of a mid, and this was kind of a lowest. And if anybody wants the full statistics, I can supply that to them, comparisons. But you start to see a little trends here. Let's look at destination choice. This is very important to us. We want to know beforehand, how is food and drink participating in a person's decision making. And here we can really see the difference between the three groups. All of these are statistically the same. All of these are statistically the same. These food, beer, and wine travelers are looking at restaurants and food experiences before they leave, and they're using it to make destination decisions. So it's not enough to have these activities available at the destination. This is what's helping people choose. People are choosing between Asheville, North Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina in the United States. People are choosing between Sydney and Melbourne in Australia. And they're using these food and drink to do it when they travel, especially true for wine and beer travelers. There's some big differences here. Statistically, those are the same and higher. Let's look at post-trip satisfaction. So we know from our research that food and drink leads to satisfaction, especially amongst culinary travelers. And worldwide, our research shows culinary travelers are about half of the travelers. in the world. So we know that it leads to satisfaction, intent to return, intent to recommend a destination. It leads to food purchases at home. So post-trip activities are very, very important to this food travel world too. So if we look at these overall satisfaction, we see the same phenomena as the last slide. These three groups are statistically the same. Doesn't matter if you're a beer lover, wine lover, beer and wine together. Food and drink experiences are especially important. So if I'm a wine lover and I'm going on a trip and I go to museums, cultural events, and wine events, or beer or restaurants, we know that these food and beverage experiences have an outsized impact on the satisfaction with the trip. And again, we see the same thing on intent to return to the destination. I didn't share the data here. We see the same thing with recommending the destination. So these food and drink activities are really what's setting us apart for the travelers, right? We may love, use the Louvre museum experience all the time. We may love the Louvre, but going to the Louvre isn't going to make me come back and say, oh my gosh, you have to go to France. It's for these travelers, it's going to be the food and drink that really people come back and talk about. All right. Attitudes are great. Let's talk about behaviors for a minute, and then I'll wrap up with a couple generalizations here. If we look at expenditures, and I need to kind of break this down a little bit for you. Lodging expenditures, no statistically significant differences. This is per day expenditure in US dollars on a typical trip. Again, there is no typical trip, but statistically, this is pretty good information. We do see under entertainment, all these groups are higher. So again, beer and wine are spending more on entertainment. If we're looking at shopping, the only significant difference is wine travelers were the highest. And we can use our stereotypes of wine travelers as older and more affluent travelers to explain that. But again, that goes across generations also. When it comes to other expenditures, including transportation, maybe this is other experiences, we see that all three of these groups are a lot higher than neither group. So again, expenditures is great. This is where it's kind of fun for me, right? We're talking about food and beverage travel. So let's look at the food and beverage expenditure differences. And over here on food and beverage, we see that wine, I'm giving you statistical differences, but we can kind of see, of course, beer and wine spend the most, wine, and then beer, and then neither. So this does kind of stand out a little bit because the wine travelers here, the beer and wine is spending more than just beer travelers. The beer and wine is spending more than the none of the above, and wine is spending more than none of the above. So there's no statistical difference here, but we can see a little bit difference. And we can explain that a little bit again by the age of the beer traveler might be a little bit younger and things like that. But I can explain it one other way too, is beer travelers spending their money in other ways besides just food and beverage. And so we look at this slide, we can kind of point that out for us as what these beer travelers are doing. Look at this right here. This is other activities people do while traveling and their likelihood to do this on a trip. I want to start here because that's where I just pointed out. Attending live music concerts, beer travelers are doing that. I'm going to get my stats here. Correct. This live music festivals, beer is doing this more than wine travelers. Beer travelers are doing this more than none of the above. And then even beer and wine is doing it more than wine. So if we're looking at this, if I'm at a destination with live music festivals, concerts, that's where I need to cross market with beer activities, get them to spend more while they're there besides just food and beverage. Looking at historic and cultural attractions, again, these beer and wine travelers are spending more than beer travelers, more than none of the above. Wine travelers are spending more than none of the above on museums and monuments. And we can explain that because beer travelers are spending their money over here. We're looking at performing arts. Again, these three are all higher than this one. We can make generalizations about the activities here, but the truth is that these are statistically similar. And then finally, taking tours. And again, we see the same thing on taking tours. All of these groups are higher than this one. So we can start to make a few conclusions based on the data. If anybody wants to reach out to me for more information, I'm happy to entertain that. So we can start to make a few conclusions. Wine, beer, and then wine and beer travelers are very similar in attitudes. They want to learn when they travel. They use food and drink in making travel decisions. It contributes to their satisfaction. It contributes to their experience while traveling. But we see slight differences in behaviors. We saw that the wine and beer travelers and wine travelers are spending a little more on food and drink. We're seeing that the beer travelers are spending a little bit more on live music events, festivals, and things like that. What can we do destination wise? Well, I think as destinations, beer and wine are both important and they can really be cross marketed. It's really difficult to be just a wine destination now. Of course, Napa, Sonoma, Willamette, Loire, right? There's some regions that are known particularly for wine, but we can start to throw beer into those areas as well. It can be a city that's known for its wine local wineries. Doesn't mean you have to grow the grapes there, right? But people want to overlap these experiences. Wine, while beverage travelers are a minority of travelers, right? We said they're less than half of the travelers. Beverage is a major satisfier of these travelers. So we need to make sure these beverage experiences are available. Even if you don't have a lot of local breweries and wineries, it might be that your restaurants, even your hotel bars, are showcasing beers and wines that are particular to the area or explorational or experiential. So we can cross-market these beer and wine activities. Again, we can look at Sonoma and Oregon as case studies on how to do that in a good way. But we also need to be careful on making generalizations about the difference between these types of travelers. If we grab somebody off the street, they'd say, well, a beer traveler is a young male and a wine traveler is an older couple. Well, that's not necessarily the case on this. We see a lot of overlap in these behaviors and a lot of overlap in what makes these folks tick. So I'm looking ahead. What we might be looking at next is trying to understand more of the day-to-day travel behavior of beer and wine travelers. We know that they look for experiences before they travel, but when they're traveling, what do they look for? How do they mix up these beer and wine experiences with other things? Are they social? Are they trendy? What are they seeking on these activities? And kind of understanding the segmentations within these groups and creating marketing action plans based on this. So again, if some destinations are doing this well, how might others do it well? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. If there's any questions, I'm happy to entertain those right now.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Always interesting to hear what you have to say. And I do have a question for you. You started in the beginning to talk about, in the beginning of your presentation, you said that wine travelers and beer travelers are interchangeable terms. Did you mean to say that? And I was wondering if
Sorry,
you
I
could
meant to say
expand on that.
wine travelers and wine tourists and beer travelers and beer tourists.
Okay.
Sorry, that's kind of important.
Yeah,
Some
small
people,
detail there.
yeah. For some tourism researchers, they think the word tourist is a bad term, and so
Yeah,
they like the word traveler. For me,
they're
they're the
equal.
same.
Yeah, no, you're
Yeah,
absolutely
wow.
right.
There was a
It's
faux pas.
No, it's exactly how we feel about food tourism, culinary tourism, gastronomy tourism. If you ask specific people, they all carry different nuances and people have a lot of emotion attached with the different terms. So you just have to make sure it's just like uh, tailoring your remarks in someone's own language or in terms that they use so that they understand you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And I was wondering, what information did you see about Generation Z or Z in there? Because I know that as this generation starts to mature, grow, start to travel a little bit more and spread their wings, they want to explore these different things. And they're also a generation that's very interested in taking their behaviors with them on the road. We saw that from one of the other presenters, Alicia. And I'm just wondering, and I know that when we did this research in 2020, and then we did their special COVID update 6 months later, but the Generation Z or Z was just starting to mature, and we weren't able to do a lot of research on them. And she also had that same footnote, the same disclaimer. She said that she had to ask people who were of legal age to participate in the survey. So, what can you make any prognosis or predictions at all about this generation?
So as far as the research method, you're right. When we did it, we surveyed people 18 and up who had taken trips, but there were very few of that generation were 21. I think we only had 21 and 22-year-olds in that generation, so we don't really have any information on here. I think what we're seeing on the newer generations is, so when we first did this study on the, especially the youngest generations, they don't always have a lot of choice in their travel. So if you're a 19, 20-year-old, right, you're really restricted based on money and time and friends and things like that. But I think right now they're aspirational, like the younger generations know they will travel, continue to travel. I think one thing we're seeing is there's going to be a blend between travel, work, and living. You know, we grew up, moved somewhere
Hmm.
permanently, and I think a lot of this generation will be, some will be digital nomads, some will have a permanent home but spend a lot of time on the road. So there's definitely this overlap as well.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think food and wine interest, I mean, we've seen it over time, the younger the generation, the more interested they are in food and drink. And so,
You said something interesting there about digital nomads, and I think that that is really going to throw a wrench into this whole target marketing idea because you talk about targeting Facebook segments or Facebook groups of people, or talking about an age group of people in America or in France, or whatever. But people are traveling everywhere. They're living everywhere. You can't talk
mhm.
about just reaching Americans in America or just reaching Australians in Australia. You have Australians living on Bali and Singapore and Nepal and Dubai. How do you make sure that you're reaching the right people? Or does this mean that we're all moving more towards behavior-based marketing?
I think I have four siblings. We're all American, but two live in Europe and two live here in the United States. And so we're definitely seeing that. I think I think the days overall of demographic segmentation are kind of behind us. We've looked at this research. We don't see a lot of, we can find some nuances between men and women, um, and between those with really high incomes and really low incomes. But as far as kind of in the middle, it all kind of blends together. So I think it's going to be, like you said, more behavioral based and then more psychographic based, which is like where
Hmm.
the psychoculinary profiles come in. And really behavior based, am I a person who spends my extra money on going to Formula One races? Am I the one who spends that on food? Am I the one who spends it on home decorating?
Shopping,
you know,
buying fashion.
Shopping,
Yeah, yeah.
buying fashion, and then kind of your reason for traveling. And we used to have leisure travel and business travel separate. And of course, the word leisure has been around for a while, but that's just totally blending together.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
So that'll be exciting to see. Um, yeah, as we go
One of
forward.
the phenomena that I've been speaking about for several years now is this concept of nano marketing, where we can be different kinds of consumers, different times of the day. And I always made the example, I said, well, like, I'm a white man. I remember when I first started saying this, I was in my 40s and I live in Portland, Oregon, and saw all this stuff. And anymore, what am I by the afternoon or what am I by the evening? You might have someone who is a project assistant by day living in New York City, and by night they're a wild and crazy maniac, or I mean, there's this people just there's so many different behaviors. You can't just put someone in a box and say you are this.
And that's what it's the limitation of the segmentation behaviors that people have liked to have done in wine and beer is they're trying to put somebody in a box. Well, think about the last three trips you take. One might, or the next three trips you'll take. One might be a business trip. One might be a romance trip with a partner. One might be for a festival. One might be with your college friends, six of you getting together in New Orleans, right? I
Hmm.
mean, even amongst the same person, especially amongst one might be a lifetime cruise of a lifetime, you know?
Interesting, very
And
much
so
so.
even like if you and just anybody's listening, just think about your last three trips or your next three trips. Unless they're three business trips to the same city, they're going to be extremely different.
Well, you were
And we're
talking about
traveling
putting,
with more generations, we're traveling with more different people, we're traveling with friends, we're traveling without spouses. We've identified that
yeah.
as a phenomenon. Yeah.
Well, you talked about putting people in boxes. I hope that we're not putting them into wine boxes.
Hey.
Boxed
Thanks.
wine.
There we go.
I know,
Canned
I know,
wine. Canned
I know.
wine. Yeah,
No,
okay.
no, don't go there, please.
Can't do it. Okay,
All
cool.
right. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for sharing your words of wisdom. It's always a pleasure listening to you and hearing what's on the top of your mind these days when it comes to our industry. So thank you again. And I will share, if you don't mind, I'll share your email with the delegates. So if they have any specific questions for you, they
Absolutely.
can contact you directly.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it, Eric.
Thank you, Matthew.